made to wear her mother's mourning black for 18 years. A Lakota chief gave her color. The deed was on the table when she walked in out of the storm. I don't remember hearing the door. What I remember is the sound of the fire pulling hard sideways, a lick of cold air that found the back of my neck, and then the door slamming shut and her standing there with snow on her shoulders, and a look on her face like she was already apologizing for something she hadn't done yet. She had a carpet bag in her right hand and a folded paper in her left, and her dress was black coat, black skirt, black boots, all of it, like she'd been poured into the color of a storm cloud and told to hold still. I was at the table because I'd been there since after supper. The deed to the eastern pasture land, the parcel my father set aside before he died, the one the Hendersons had been chewing at the edges of for 3 years. It was laid flat under the lamplight, and I was looking at it the same way a man looks at a wound he can't do much about. 32 acres of grass running down to the Silver River. Good bottomland. Winter grazing, spring calving ground. It was my land, and I knew it, and the men who wanted it knew it, and the judge in Cutter's Mill had been told it twice, and none of that was doing the land much good. She said, "I'm sorry to come in without knocking. The wind took the door." I said, "The wind does that." She looked around. I had a good fire and a lamp and not much else. The longhouse was warm, but it wasn't a place built to impress anyone. She looked at the deed on the table without meaning to. Then she looked at the floor. I asked her what she needed. She said she needed to sit down if I would permit it, and that she had a letter of introduction from Reverend Coles in Laramie, and she held the folded paper out like it was something she owed me. I didn't take it. I said, "Set it down, set yourself down too." Her name was Nora Marsh. She told me that sitting by the fire while the storm went at the roof. She was 34 years old, she said, schoolteacher, trained in Philadelphia. Her father had died 8 weeks before, and she had come west to teach at the settlement school in Decker's Crossing, which was 40 miles south and east of here. She'd been on the stage when the storm hit, had made it as far as my gate post before the driver decided that was far enough and turned back toward Wickham. He had given her directions to my house. She would pay for a night's shelter if I named a price. I told her I didn't name prices for weather. She looked at her hands. She had good hands. Not soft hands, these were hands that had been working at something for a long time. I noticed, and then I looked back at the fire. I am called Kanunpa Maza by my people. The men at the trading post and in the townships call me Iron Pipe, which is close enough. I am chief of a band of 43 Lakota who winter in the valley between this ridge and the next, and I built this house with log walls and a plank floor 20 years ago because the winters were getting harder, and I was tired of watching old women freeze. My wife Winyan Chinchala, Little Bird Woman, died 7 years ago of a fever that came up the river one spring. Since then I have run my cattle and kept my people fed and fought the Hendersons over my eastern pasture, and I have not had a woman in this house at night. I am 56 years old, and I will tell you that plainly. My hair is iron gray, and there are lines on my face from weather and from things that are not weather, and I am not a man anyone has thought to soften in a very long time. She was still apologizing. I don't mean she was talking. She'd gone quiet after I told her to sit, but the set of her shoulders was an apology. She held herself like a woman who had learned that taking up space was a thing she had to answer for. I asked her if she was hungry. She said she didn't want to trouble me. I put a pot on the fire. In the morning the storm was still going. She was up before me, which I wasn't expecting. I came out of the back room and she had the fire built up and the coffee pot heating, and she was standing at the table looking at the deed. She heard me and stepped back fast, like I'd caught her at something. I said, "You can look at it." She said, "I'm sorry, I was just reading." She paused. "Your name is on it, and someone else's name is on it too below yours. In different ink." I poured the coffee. I said, "That's a forgery." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I'm a school teacher. I can read quite clearly. That second signature reads Elias J. Henderson." "Yes, it does." "And it's forged." "Yes." She looked at the deed another moment. She said, "Can you prove it?" I said I had a witness, my father's friend, an old man named Talks Too Long, who had been present when the original deed was signed and had never seen anyone else sign it. He was willing to swear to it. The trouble was that Talks Too Long was 78, spoke little English, and that Elias Henderson's brother-in-law was the county judge. She sat down. The morning light was coming thin and gray through the one window, and it caught the side of her face. She had dark circles under her eyes. She hadn't slept much. She said, "Where did you learn to read English?" I told her, "A missionary school outside of Fort Pierre, 40 years ago when I was a boy." I told her I hated it for the first 2 years, and then I understood that the language was a tool, and a tool wasn't a thing you hated. It was a thing you used. She looked at me the way people sometimes look at you when they expected one thing and got something else. She said, "My father didn't approve of Indians learning to read." I said, "Your father sounds like many men I have met." She made a sound that might have been a laugh, except it stopped before it got anywhere. She looked down at the table. She said, "My father disapproved of most things." I drank my coffee. The storm was making a sound against the north wall, like something pressing to get in. She said, "I've been in this dress for 4 years, this particular dress, and others like it before that." I didn't say anything. She wasn't talking to me exactly. She was talking to the fire. She said, "My mother died when I was 16. My father decided we would grieve publicly for a proper period. 1 year, standard mourning, I had a black dress made." She smoothed the skirt of the one she had on. 1 year became 2, 2 became 5. He said it honored her memory. When I was 20, I tried to wear a brown dress I'd saved wages for. He burned it in the yard. He didn't raise his voice. He just burned it and looked at me and went inside. She was quiet for a moment. My mother was 31 when she died. She loved blue things, birds, sky ribbons. She had a blue shawl she wore every Sunday. I looked at her. Her hands were flat on the table on either side of the coffee cup. She had not asked me for anything. She was just saying a thing. I said, "Your father is dead now." She said, 8 weeks ago. I said, "And you came west?" She said, "I have $34 and a teaching certificate and a carpet bag." Yes. The fire made its sound. Outside, the snow was still coming. I said, "Decker's Crossing is 40 miles in good weather, and the roads will not be good for another 2, 3 days." She nodded. She already knew this. I said, "You can stay." She looked up at me. I said, "There is a back room. I will sleep out here. When the road's clear, I will take you south in my wagon." She said, "I don't want to be a trouble to you." I said, "You keep saying that." She was quiet. Then, "I know." I said, "Being here in a storm is not trouble, it is weather." I picked up the deed off the table and folded it. "You want more coffee?" She said yes, and that was the first time I saw her look at something in this house without apology in her eyes. Talks Too Long came the third day, when the storm had broken to gray drizzle and the valley was all white and still. He came on the bay horse he'd had for 12 years, picking along the ridge, and I went out to meet him. He looked past me at the house. He said in Lakota, "There's a woman in your house." I said, "She's a school teacher. She was caught in the storm." He looked at me for a while. He was a small man, thin now, with eyes that had seen everything there was to see in 78 years, and were not particularly surprised by any of it. He said, "A school teacher in a black dress." I said, "Yes." He said, "Is she staying?" I said, "She's going to Decker's Crossing when the road's clear." He dismounted slowly and handed me the reins and said, "That is not what I asked." We went inside. Nora was at the table with a primer she'd taken from her carpet bag. She was teaching herself Lakota from a missionary booklet someone had put together at Fort Pierre badly, with half the words wrong. Talks too long looked at the booklet. He sat down across from her without being asked. He pointed at a word and said the right pronunciation. She repeated it not quite right. He pointed at her mouth, then at his own, the way a man shapes his lips to make a sound. He said it again. She tried again. He shook his head, but there was something in his face. They went through 6 words before he looked at me and said in Lakota, "She's serious." I said yes. He said, "Where is she from?" I told him. He said, "A long way." He looked at her. "Her father treated her badly." I said, "How do you know that?" He said, "She doesn't know what to do with her hands when she's not working. She's always waiting for someone to be angry with her." He paused. "Her dress is wrong." I said, "It's mourning." He said, "For who?" I said, "Her mother. 18 years ago." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's a long time to make someone mourn." He looked at me again with those old patient eyes. "You going to do something about it?" I said, "She's going to Decker's Crossing." He made a sound like he didn't find that very interesting, and went back to correcting her pronunciation. The road south cleared on the 5th day. I had my 2 horses hitched and the wagon loaded before dawn. She came out in the gray light with her carpet bag, and she looked at the wagon and then she looked at me, and for a moment she didn't say anything. She said, "You've been very kind." I said, "I've been practical. Come on, the light's going fast." She climbed up without help. I noticed that. She didn't wait to see if I was going to offer a hand. She just got up. We drove south through the valley. The snow was crusted hard and the horse's breath made white clouds and the sky was the color of old iron. She asked me about the land, the ridge lines, the timber stands, the way the river bent east past the Henderson property and came back around. She asked good questions and she listened to the answers. Not politely, actually listened, the way a person listens when they want to know something. I told her about the eastern pasture. I don't know why. I hadn't talked about it to anyone except my lawyer in Cheyenne, who had not been very encouraging. I told her about the deed, about the forgery, about the judge and Elias Henderson's family connections. She listened all the way through without speaking. Then she said, "In Philadelphia I worked one summer for a land registry, filing and cataloging. I know what a chain of title looks like." I said, "Do you?" She said, "The forgery would have to match the original grantor's signature. Your father's. Is there another document with his original signature on it that predates the Henderson edition?" I said there was, the original land grant from 1851. I kept it in a locked box. She said, "A handwriting comparison between the original grant and the deed. If the forgery is crude enough, you don't need a friendly judge. You need a federal land commissioner's office. They're not from here. Henderson's brother-in-law has no jurisdiction over them." I looked at her. She was looking at the road ahead. The wind had lifted some of her hair from under her hat. She said, "I'm not a lawyer, but I'm right." I said, "Yes, you are." She turned and looked at me, just for a moment. The morning was cold and her cheeks were red from it and her eyes were gray-green, the color of the river in early spring. Then she looked back at the road. I kept driving. Something had settled in my chest that I hadn't noticed being unsettled before. Decker's Crossing was smaller than she'd expected. I could tell that by the way she looked at it when we came over the ridge, the cluster of buildings, the mud Main Street, the schoolhouse with one window boarded up. She didn't say anything disappointed, but she adjusted her grip on the carpet bag. The school superintendent was a man named Galt, red-faced and heavy, who looked at me the way men in those towns often looked at me when I came in driving a wagon. He looked at Nora, then at me, then at Nora again and said, "I was expecting you 3 days ago, Miss Marsh." She said, "I was caught in the storm. Chief Ironpipe was kind enough to provide shelter." Galt looked at me. I looked back at him. He looked at Nora and said the boarding house was the third building on the right, and that school started Monday, and that he trusted. She understood the children in this district needed firm handling. She said she understood the children needed teaching, and that she was prepared to do that. He blinked. He wasn't used to that either, I thought. I helped her with the bag as far as the boarding house door. She said, "Thank you for the lodging and the coffee." I said, "Write to the Federal Land Office in Cheyenne. Address it to the Land Commissioner. Tell them what you told me about the chain of title." She said, "I will." I said, "Come up to the valley if you need anything." She looked at me. She said, "Why?" I said, "Because I said you could." She held my eyes a moment. Then she nodded once and went inside. I drove back north in the afternoon cold, and I did not think about her eyes until I was most of the way home. Then I thought about them the rest of the way. The letter came from the Federal Land Commissioner's office 6 weeks later. They were sending an examiner. My lawyer in Cheyenne wrote to say he didn't know how I'd got the commissioner's office to move so fast. They were not known for speed. I wrote back that a school teacher in Decker's Crossing had written a very clear letter explaining the matter. He wrote back, "What school teacher?" Nora came up to the valley on a Friday in early March, on a hired horse she'd managed without apparent trouble. Talks Too Long was sitting outside my door mending a harness when she came up the track, and he watched her ride in and dismount, and he looked at me and said, in Lakota, "I see she's not gone after all." I told him to mind the harness. She stayed for the afternoon. She brought papers. She had done what she said and written to the land commissioner, but she had also done more than that. She had written to a law professor she knew from Philadelphia, and he had sent her a 40-page ruling from a federal case out of Missouri that turned on exactly the same issue of signature fraud on a land deed. She laid it out on the table and walked me through it, her finger moving along the paragraphs, her voice steady. She had marked the relevant passages with pencil. I sat across from her and watched her work. She had energy in her when she was doing something useful. Her hands moved. Her face came alive. Out of the black dress in that room, or rather inside it, she was something that had been kept pressed flat for a long time and was trying to remember its own shape. I said when she'd finished, "You did all this." She said, "I had evenings." I said, "You didn't have to." She looked up. She said, "You sheltered me in a blizzard. You didn't charge me anything. You took me 40 miles in the cold. Why wouldn't I help?" I said, "Most people wouldn't call that a debt." She said, "I'm not talking about debt." The fire made its sound. Outside, the first real thaw was beginning, and you could hear it in the trees. I said, "How are the children?" She smiled. It was the first time I'd seen her do that, not the edge of it, but the real thing. She said they were difficult and wonderful, and 2 of them were reading ahead of where they should be. She said one boy reminded her of someone. She didn't say who. I looked at my hands. She said, "I found something in Laramie at the dry goods store. I ordered it 3 weeks ago." She reached into her bag and took out a folded piece of cloth. She unfolded it on the table. It was a scarf, blue, the particular blue of a clear sky after rain. Not dark, not pale, that color. She said, "I know I don't look like myself in color yet. I haven't for a long time, but I thought—" She stopped. She looked at the cloth. "My mother loved blue." I looked at the scarf. I looked at her. I said, "Put it on." She was still for a moment. Then she lifted it and put it around her shoulders over the black coat. The color sat against all that black like a thing that had found the right place for the first time. She didn't ask if it looked right. I said, "It looks right." She smoothed it once, and her face was careful and quiet, and I understood that I was watching a woman who had worn 18 years of someone else's grief put on the first piece of herself. She had been allowed in a very long time. The land examiner came in April. His name was Hatcher, out of the Denver field office, a dry-looking man with a case full of documents and an expression that suggested he had been lied to by everyone he'd ever met and was waiting to be lied to again. He was not local. He did not know Elias Henderson or the county judge or any of the rest of it. He looked at land documents and he knew what he was looking at. Henderson had gotten word the examiner was coming. He and his lawyer arrived at my place the morning before Hatcher was due, and they sat in their wagon at my gate, and Henderson called out my name. I came out. Henderson was 60, wide in the chest, and he'd had his way in this valley for 15 years on the back of money and connections, and the willingness to push until things moved. He looked down at me from the wagon seat, and he said that he wanted to settle this before any government man came in and made a mess of things. He said he would pay me for the eastern pasture, a fair price, and we could put the whole matter to bed. I said, it's not your land to buy. He said the deed said otherwise. I said the deed is forged. He got a look then that I had seen before on men who weren't used to being said no to flatly. He said there was no proof of forgery. He said it was my word and an old Indian's word against a legal document. He said I should consider my position carefully, and the position of my people, because water rights in this valley were a fragile thing, and he had friends on the irrigation board. He waited for me to think about that. I said, come back with your lawyer on Thursday. The examiner will hear you then. He said something else. I went back inside. Hatcher spent 2 days on the documents. He worked at the table I cleared for him, with the original 1851 grant and the later deed side by side, and he used a glass lens and he wrote in a small notebook. He was methodical. He didn't talk much. He asked me 3 questions the first day and 2 questions the second, all of them specific: dates, names, the location of the signing, who had witnessed it. I answered each one directly. On the afternoon of the second day, Talks Too Long came in and sat down and waited. Hatcher looked at him. Talks Too Long looked at Hatcher. I told Hatcher that this man had witnessed the original signing. Hatcher asked his questions. I translated. Talks Too Long answered. Then Talks Too Long said something I didn't translate right away. Hatcher said, "What did he say?" I said, "He said he was present at the signing, and he knows what was on the document then and what was not. And he says that a man who would forge the name of a man who is dead is not a man to be trusted with anyone's water." Hatcher wrote that down. Nora was there the day Hatcher delivered his findings. She had come up for the week. She'd gotten permission from Galt to miss the last days of school before spring break because she told him a land matter required her attention. Galt had not wanted to give it, but she had stood in his doorway until he did, and she had told me that with the same matter-of-fact plainness she used to tell me about anything else. Hatcher sat across the table from me and Henderson's lawyer, and he opened his notebook, and he read from it in that dry, careful voice. He said the signatures on the 2 documents showed 12 distinct variations in letter formation, inconsistent with natural variation over time. He said the second signature showed pen pressure patterns inconsistent with the age and known health of the signatory at the date recorded. He said the paper itself at the signature line showed chemical evidence of prior writing having been removed. He said it was his determination that the signature on the deed was not genuine. The room was quiet. Henderson's lawyer said something about appealing. Hatcher said the commissioner's ruling would be binding pending a federal review, which they were welcome to seek, and that in his experience such reviews, when sought on the basis of a field determination as thorough as this one, did not generally go differently. Henderson looked at me. I looked at him. He picked up his hat and left. After they were gone, Hatcher shook my hand. He said it was a well-documented case, and someone had done good work getting it in front of the right office. He looked briefly at Nora, who was sitting in the corner chair with her blue scarf on and a book in her hands, not pretending she hadn't been listening. He left. I heard his horse on the road for a while, and then it was just the sound of the valley. Talks Too Long, who had been leaning against the wall the whole time, said in Lakota, "The land is yours." I said, "It was always mine." He said, "Yes, but now everyone knows it." Nora looked up from her book. She was looking at me. She said, "Are you going to stand there or are you going to sit down?" I sat down. She said, "Congratulations." I said, "You did most of it." She said, "I wrote a letter." I said, "It was a very good letter." She looked at me with those gray-green eyes. She said, "It was a true letter, that's all." Talks Too Long made a sound I had heard him make over many years, which was the sound of a man declining to say "I told you so." She went back to Decker's Crossing on Monday. The school needed her. I drove her down in the wagon again, the same road as before, but spring now, the willows coming green along the river, the sky that particular blue. She had the scarf on over a dress that was still black but maybe a shade less deliberate, and she talked about the children most of the way down. The two who were reading ahead. A boy named Peter who she thought had a very precise mind, who asked questions in complete sentences and then waited to understand the answer before asking the next one. She said, "He reminds me of you. That's what I was going to say before, that day in March." I said, "I was 63 before anyone told me." I reminded them of an 8-year-old. She laughed, the real laugh, not the edge of it. It was not a loud laugh. It was warm and a little surprised at itself, and it went out into the spring air and disappeared. I kept my eyes on the road. I said, "What will you do after the term ends?" She said, "Galt has offered me another year." I said, "Will you take it?" She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I don't know." She was looking at the river, the silver river where it ran along beside the road. She said, "I've been going somewhere my whole life. Going to school, going to work, going to grieve, going to be useful. I haven't spent very long just," she paused, "being somewhere, knowing it was mine." I said, "The valley is 40 miles north." She was quiet again, not the apologetic quiet, just thinking. She said, "I know it is." I said, "The school commissioner for the territory comes through twice a year. If there were a school nearer the northern settlements, Wickham, or the Lakota families in the valley, he would want it supplied." She said, "Are you trying to hire me?" I said, "I am trying to describe an opportunity." She turned and looked at me. I was watching the road, but I could feel her looking. She said, "Iron pipe." I said, "Yes." She said, "What are you actually saying?" I turned and looked at her then. We were on the flat stretch where the road widened out, going slow. The valley was behind us and Decker's Crossing was still a mile ahead. Her face was calm and waiting, and the blue scarf was around her shoulders in the spring light, and she was watching me with something in her face that was not apology, not gratitude, not the look of a woman waiting for something to be taken from her. She was just watching me, the way a person watches when they want an honest answer. I said, "I am saying that the valley is 40 miles north, and I know the road and the weather and everything in between. I am saying there is a room in my house. I am saying you have sat at my table twice, and it seems to me to be the right number of seats for that table." I stopped. I said, "And I am 56 years old, and I have not been careless with words for a long time, and I am not being careless now." She looked at me for a moment that was longer than a moment. She said, "Ask me at the end of the school term." I said, "I will." She said, "And I'll answer honestly." I said, "I know you will." She turned back to the road. She put her hand over mine on the reins, just for a moment, warm, plain, nothing performed about it, and then she took it back and set it in her lap. I drove on. The term ended in June. I came down with the wagon on a Thursday, and she was ready. Her carpet bag was bigger than it had been in November. She came out when she heard the horses, and she was wearing a dress that was not black. It was not the blue scarf, though she had that too. The dress was the color of good clay, reddish brown, simple. She looked like a woman who had decided something and was done deciding it. She came down the boarding house steps, and she put the bag in the back of the wagon, and she climbed up beside me, and she sat there in the morning light looking forward. She said, "I didn't tell Galt why I was leaving." I said, "What did you tell him?" She said, "I told him the northern settlements needed a school, and I was going to see about starting one." I said, "That's true." She said, "It is." The horses moved. The road north opened up in front of us, the long way back through the valley with the river beside it, and the ridge coming up in the distance, the grass already tall, and the cottonwoods putting out their white fluff that drifted across the road like slow snow. She said, "Tell me about the valley." I told her. I told her about the winter pasture on the east side where the river bends, which was mine now and would stay mine. I told her about the Lakota families who wintered there, and the ones who had started to stay through spring and summer, and the children in those families who had good mines and no school. I told her about the ridge and the timber above it, and the way the valley looked in the early morning when the light was still horizontal, and everything was long shadows and gold grass. She listened the whole way. She asked questions. She kept the blue scarf on her shoulders even though the day was warm. Coming up the last long grade to the ridge, with the valley floor spread out below, she said, "It's what I thought it would be." I said, "You imagined it?" She said, "In the evenings, yes." She looked at it a while. "I imagined a lot of things." I said, "I know." She turned and looked at me. I said, "I imagined some things too." She was quiet, and then she said, "Did they look like this?" I said, "Close enough." She held my gaze a moment. Then she turned back to the valley and put her hand in the crook of my arm, not leaning on me, just there, the way a person stands beside something they're not going anywhere from. I did not look at her. I looked at the road. The horses knew the way. We were married in October, before the first snow. Talks Too Long performed the ceremony in the old way, and Reverend Coles came up from Laramie and did it in the English way too, because Nora said she wanted both, and because she was right. There were 40 of my people there, and some families from Wickham, and 2 of Nora's children from the school she had started by then in the big room of the south cabin. A boy named Peter and his older sister, both of them serious-faced, and watching everything the way children watch when they want to remember something. I do not remember much of what was said. I remember the way the valley looked that morning, the snow on the upper ridge and the grass still showing gold lower down. I remember the smell of the fire. I remember Talks Too Long's voice, which was the voice I had known my whole life, steady and low, saying words I had heard at other people's ceremonies and never thought would be mine again. And I remember when it was done, when we turned to face each other in the cold October light, Nora looked at me the way she had looked at me on the ridge that first June morning, not waiting for anything, not apologizing, not performing, just seeing me, all of me, and holding still. She put her hand against my face. Her palm was warm against my jaw, the way a hand is warm when the person it belongs to means it. The whole valley could see it. I set my hand over hers. The wind came down off the ridge and lifted the edge of her shawl, and it was the shawl she had made herself, the one she'd worked through 3 months of evenings, blue, the particular blue her mother had loved, bright against everything else. It went out in the wind, and she let it, and she didn't look away from me. I am 60 years old now, and I have been married 4 years, and the eastern pasture is still mine. The grass goes down to the Silver River and the cattle winter on it, and in the spring the calves come. The school in the south cabin has 11 children now, and a second teacher who comes up from Wickham 3 days a week, and Peter, who is 12, and does not remind me of anyone but himself, has been reading things that would give Galt a headache if he knew. Nora is standing at the window this morning. The light is coming in and catching the side of her face, and she is watching something outside, a hawk, maybe, or the horses. She has a coffee cup in her hand, and she is wearing a blue shirt, one of many blue things she has accumulated, steadily, without ceremony, over 4 years of deciding what color she is. I have watched her do it. It is not a dramatic thing. It is the quiet accumulation of a person coming back to herself, one small choice at a time. A blue shirt, a green ribbon, a red skirt for the spring celebration. She does it without announcement, and she does not ask my opinion, and she does not need me to say it looks right, though sometimes I do. This morning I said, "What are you looking at?" She said, "The river." I said, "It's cold." She said, "It's beautiful." She was right. From the window you could see where the Silver River bends east past the old Henderson fence line, which is my fence line now, and then comes back, the water dark and moving under the ice at the edges. The valley has had its first hard frost, and everything is still, and the light is that low winter light that makes even cold things look like they are worth staying for. She turned from the window and looked at me. 4 years in this house, and she still sometimes looks at me as if she is noticing me fresh, which is a thing I have decided not to understand too carefully, only to be grateful for. She said, "Come look." I got up and went to the window and stood beside her. She took my hand. We stood there in the morning cold, looking at the river and the valley and the ridge beyond it, which has my name on the deed and the land commissioner's seal. Talks Too Long came by later that morning on his old bay horse, and he looked in through the window at the two of us standing there, and he rode on without stopping. He told me later he saw no need to interrupt. I told him he had never needed a reason to interrupt anything in his life. He said that was true, but some things looked complete already, and those were the ones you left alone. He was right. He usually is.